Cedar Creek, Missouri, wasn't the kind of place anyone would expect to become the center of a murder investigation. With a population barely scraping 3,000, the town was known more for its endless cornfields and quiet evenings than any hint of danger. The locals all knew each other by name, by face, by family history. Gossip was the lifeblood of the town, but crimes, they were unheard of. That all changed on the first chilly morning of October, when 17-year-old Emily Dawson didn't show up for her shift at the local diner. At first, no one was overly concerned. Kids that age were known to be late from time to time. But Emily wasn't that kind of kid. She was reliable, one of the town's golden girls, good grades, track star, and homecoming queen. So when she missed her shift without a word, it sent ripples of unease through the town. Sheriff Tom Briggs got the first call from the diner's owner, Mrs. Kravitz, around 8 a.m. Emily's parents hadn't heard from her either, and as noon rolled around, the tension in Cedar Creek thickened. The sun had barely crested the trees when Sheriff Briggs and his deputy, Mark Slater, started making the rounds. They checked her friends, her boyfriend, everywhere she might have gone after leaving the diner the night before. But no one had seen her since her shift ended at 9:30 p.m. By 3 p.m., search parties were formed. They combed through the woods near Cedar Creek, the abandoned barn where local teens sometimes hung out, and the creek itself. Hours passed, and as dusk settled over the town, a cold knot of fear began to tighten. It wasn't until the next morning that the horror struck. Emily's body was found in a field at the edge of town, face down in the muddy earth, her once vibrant blonde hair matted with blood. The brutal nature of the crime sent shockwaves. Emily Dawson wasn't just missing, she had been murdered. The news of Emily's murder spread faster than anyone could have imagined. By the time the police arrived at the crime scene, half the town already knew something had gone terribly wrong. Parents clutched their children tighter, locking doors in broad daylight, something that had never been necessary in Cedar Sea. Sheriff Briggs, normally calm and collected, stood over Emily's lifeless body with a mix of anger and sorrow in his eyes. He had known her since she was a little girl, watched her grow up like a daughter of the town. Now she was gone, her body left to rot in the field she had run through as a child. "No one deserves this," he muttered to Deputy Slater, his voice thick with disbelief. The investigation began immediately. Briggs had seen his share of tragic accidents in Cedar Creek, but never a murder. The forensic team, called in from the state capitol, arrived by mid-morning. They cordoned off the field, examining every inch of the scene. Emily's body showed signs of a struggle, bruises along her wrists, dirt beneath her nails, but there were no clear leads. Her clothes were torn, but there was no indication of sexual assault. It was a brutal killing, and yet it felt personal. The town's residents were questioned one by one. Emily's parents, distraught and hollow-eyed, could barely speak when Briggs came to their house. Her mother clutched a framed photo of Emily, as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling apart. She didn't have enemies, her father insisted. Everyone loved her. But as the sheriff knew all too well, in a town this small, secrets festered beneath the surface. People kept up appearances, but that didn't mean there wasn't darkness lurking. And now, that darkness had claimed its first victim. With every passing hour, the tension in Cedar Creek grew. People whispered in hushed tones, casting nervous glances at their neighbors. No one knew who could have done this, but one thing was certain: someone in Cedar was hiding something. At the third day of the investigation, Cedar Creek was no longer the sleepy town it had once been. The local news vans had arrived, reporters hungry for details about the shocking murder of Emily Dawson. Everyone had their theories, but no one had any solid answers. Sheriff Briggs, frustrated by the lack of leads, began focusing on those closest to Emily. The first name that came up more than once was Kyle Harrington, Emily's boyfriend. Kyle had been dating Emily for almost a year, and by all accounts, their relationship was stable. But no one is above suspicion in a murder case. Sheriff Briggs, aware of how quickly rumors spread in small towns, decided to bring Kyle in for questioning. Kyle, a wiry 18-year-old with short brown hair and nervous eyes, sat across from Briggs in the small interrogation room at the sheriff's office. His hands trembled as he twirled a cap in his fingers. He hadn't slept much in the past few days, and it showed. "We were fine," Kyle said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I loved her." Briggs watched him carefully, noting every twitch, every hesitation. "Kyle, you were the last person to see her alive. You were at the diner when she finished her shift, right?" Kyle nodded. "Yeah, I was. I picked her up. We went to the old bridge for a while, just to talk. She seemed off, though, like she was distracted." "Did she say anything about being in trouble?" Briggs leaned forward, his voice steady. "Was she scared of someone? Maybe someone was following her?" Kyle shook his head. "No, she didn't say anything like that. I dropped her off at home around 10. Said that's the last time I saw her, I swear. Can anyone confirm that? Briggs asked, his gaze sharp. I mean, no one was outside, Kyle admitted. But she went inside. I'm sure of it. Briggs didn't show his frustration, but Kyle's story wasn't helping. There was no proof he had dropped her off, and no one had seen Emily after 9:30. Look, Kyle, Briggs said, I need you to be honest with me. Did you and Emily argue that night? Anything out of the ordinary? Kyle's eyes darkened. No, I'd never heard her. We didn't fight. She was just quiet. I figured she was tired from work. Briggs leaned back, his mind racing. Something about Kyle's demeanor seemed off, but it wasn't enough to arrest him, not yet. He was just one of many who would need to be looked at carefully. After releasing Kyle, the sheriff couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the truth was still buried somewhere deeper in the town. While Sheriff Briggs was following up with Kyle, Deputy Slater was combing through Emily's personal life, looking for any signs of trouble. Slater, a former military man with a keen eye for detail, had spent most of the day digging through her phone records, school history, and social media. What he found wasn't shocking, but it was concerning. Emily had been messaging someone frequently in the weeks leading up to her death, someone who wasn't Kyle. The conversations were cryptic, but the tone seemed tense. The name on the account was Rogue_Rider87, an anonymous username with no real clues as to their identity. Most of the messages had been deleted, but a few remained. The last one, sent the night before her disappearance, read, "You can't keep this secret forever." Slater, intrigued and slightly unnerved, brought the findings to Briggs. She was talking to someone she didn't want anyone to know about, Slater said, tapping the screen of Emily's phone. Whoever this is, they knew something about her, something she wanted to hide. Briggs furrowed his brow. You think this was blackmail? Could be, or maybe something worse, Slater replied. I've reached out to the platform to trace the account, but we're not going to hear back for a few days. It's a burner profile for sure, though. Briggs rubbed his temples. Every new piece of information seemed to lead to more questions. Emily, the picture-perfect girl, had been hiding something. And now, that secret could be the key to finding her killer. The sheriff ordered a deeper dive into Emily's life. Her friends were called back for second interviews, her teachers were questioned, and even her family was put under the microscope. While most of the town had nothing but glowing things to say about Emily, there were a few whispered comments about her recent behavior. Some said she'd become withdrawn in the weeks before her death. Others claimed they had seen her meeting someone in secret, but no one could pinpoint who. Briggs knew small towns like Cedar Creek well. Everyone liked to pretend they had clean hands, but people had a way of hiding their darkest truths. The deeper Sheriff Briggs and Deputy Slater dug into Emily Dawson's life, the more they realized how much they didn't know about the girl everyone thought they understood. Behind her sunny smiles and perfect reputation, there were shadows of secrets kept close. As they went through her texts, emails, and social media, they started to piece together a different side of Emily. A few days after they discovered the messages with Rogue_Rider87, they finally got a hit from the tech company tracing the account. It led to an IP address in town, someone local. The name attached to the IP stunned Briggs. It was Tyler Connors, a 25-year-old high school dropout who lived on the outskirts of Cedar Creek, and a guy with a questionable history. Tyler had a reputation. While never arrested for anything major, he'd been involved in petty theft, fights, and had a known temper. He was one of those people everyone avoided, someone always on the fringes of society. But how could Emily, the town's golden girl, be connected to a guy like Tyler? Briggs didn't waste any time. He and Slater headed to Tyler's rundown house, a small, weather-beaten structure that sat behind a thicket of trees at the end of a dirt road. As they pulled up, the smell of smoke from a nearby bonfire mixed with the dampness of the October air. Tyler was outside, leaning against a rusted pickup truck, staring at them with cold, calculating eyes as they approached. Sheriff, Tyler said, his voice flat. What can I do for you? Briggs didn't bother with pleasantries. We need to talk to you about Emily Dawson. Tyler raised an eyebrow, but his face remained impassive. Heard about what happened. Tragic. Should we know you were talking to her online? Slater interjected, his eyes narrowing as he watched Tyler's reaction. We've traced messages between you two. For the first time, Tyler's composure faltered. He took a step back, the confident facade cracking. Look, I knew Emily, he admitted, his voice lowering. But not like that. We weren't close. Why the anonymous messages then? Briggs pressed. Why all the secrecy? Tyler crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. She didn't want people knowing we were talking. And I didn't want anyone in my business either. Small town like this, you know how fast people talk. But it wasn't anything serious. She just wanted advice on something. Briggs exchanged a glance with Slater. Advice on what? Tyler hesitated, his eyes darting from Briggs to Slater, then back again. She was scared. She didn't tell me everything, but she was afraid of someone. Kept saying she was in over her head. In over her head with what? Slater asked, taking a step forward, his tone pressing. I don't know, Tyler said, shaking his head. That's all she told me. I tried asking her, but she clammed up, said she'd figure it out on her own. Briggs studied him carefully. Tyler's story didn't absolve him, but it gave them a different angle to work with. If Emily was scared, it meant there was more to this than anyone realized. It wasn't just about some teenage relationship gone wrong. Something bigger was at play. Where were you the night she disappeared? Briggs asked, his tone serious. I was home. Alone, Tyler replied, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. No one can vouch for me, but I didn't touch her, Sheriff. I swear. Briggs wasn't convinced, but he knew he didn't have enough to bring Tyler in yet. He left, but not before warning Tyler to stay in town. As they drove away, Slater glanced at Briggs. You believe him? Briggs sighed. He's hiding something, but I'm not sure he's the killer. Not yet, anyway. With Tyler Connors in their sights, the investigation took on a new intensity. While Briggs had his suspicions about Tyler, he couldn't ignore that Emily's fear pointed to something bigger. But if it wasn't Tyler, who could Emily have been afraid of? The next lead came unexpectedly from an unlikely source. Susan Marks, Emily's best friend since childhood, requested another meeting with the sheriff. Sitting across from Briggs in his office, Susan looked visibly nervous, twisting her hands in her lap. I didn't tell you everything the first time, Susan confessed, her voice shaky. I was scared. I didn't know if it was important, but now, after hearing what's going on, I think I should have said something earlier. Briggs leaned forward. What is it, Susan? Susan glanced around, as if checking for unseen eyes. A couple of weeks before she died, Emily mentioned that she thought someone was following her. She said she saw this same car parked outside the diner a few times, and then it started showing up near her house. Did she tell you what kind of car? Briggs asked, his heart rate picking up. Susan nodded. It was an old green sedan. She didn't know the person driving it, but she said it gave her a really bad feeling. Briggs scribbled down the details, his mind racing. This was new, and it changed everything. If someone had been stalking Emily, it opened up a whole new set of possibilities. Did she tell anyone else? Briggs pressed. Susan shook her head. She didn't want to make a big deal out of it. She thought maybe it was a coincidence at first, but she got more freaked out as it kept happening. Briggs sat back in his chair, processing the information. Emily had been scared, and for good reason. Someone had been following her, watching her, and now she was dead. If they could find this car, they might just find her killer. After Susan left, Briggs immediately had issued the green sedan. With this new lead, the investigation shifted again. No longer focused solely on the people close to Emily. They now had to consider that a predator had been stalking her. As the hunt for the mysterious car began, Briggs couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were running out of time. Every day that passed without finding the killer meant the darkness in Cedar Creek deepened, and with it, the uneasy sense that Emily's murder was only the beginning. The search for the green sedan turned Cedar Creek into a pressure cooker. As word of the car spread, paranoia swept through the town like wildfire. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Conversations at the diner were hushed, and front doors stayed locked even during the day. The knowledge that Emily had been followed for weeks before her murder unsettled everyone. If someone had been stalking her in plain sight, they could be anywhere, watching anyone. Sheriff Briggs felt the weight of the town's fear growing heavier with every passing day. As he sat in his office, sifting through tips from locals, most of which led to nothing, he couldn't shake the growing frustration gnawing at him. The case was spiraling, and the killer was still out there. Somewhere in Cedar Creek, the truth was hiding, but it was buried deep under layers of fear, lies, and secrets. That evening, as the sun began to set, Deputy Slater walked into the sheriff's office, looking more serious than usual. "We've got something," Slater said, dropping a stack of papers on the desk. "We ran a search through old records, like you asked. There was a hit on a green sedan." Briggs' pulse quickened. "Whose?" Slater pulled out a file. "The car is registered to David Bowen. He's a local guy, works construction. Lives out on the edge of town. Thing is, he's got a bit of a record, domestic violence charges from years ago, but nothing recent. It didn't stick, but still, might be worth a visit." Briggs stared at the name. He knew David Bowen from around town, had even seen him now and then, but never thought much of him. A quiet guy, kept to himself mostly. But domestic violence charges. That was a red flag that couldn't be ignored. He rose from his desk, grabbing his coat. Let's go pay him a visit. They drove out to Bowen's place, a modest single-story house sitting on an overgrown lot at the edge of Cedar Creek. The place had an air of neglect, overgrown grass, peeling paint, and broken-down equipment scattered in the yard. It didn't look like the home of a man with much to lose, and that made Briggs uneasy. As they approached the door, Briggs could feel the tension creeping up his spine. He knocked firmly, the hollow sound echoing through the still evening air. After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing David Bowen standing in the doorway. He was a burly man, thick arms crossed over his chest, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the sheriff and deputy on his doorstep. "Sheriff Briggs," Bowen said, his voice low and gravelly. "What's this about?" "We're following up on a lead," Briggs said, his tone neutral but firm. "We've had reports of a green sedan seen around town connected to a case we're working on. We'd like to ask you a few questions." Bowen's eyes flickered for a moment, but he didn't budge. "I haven't done anything. That car's been parked out back for months. Engine's shot. Haven't driven it in a while." Briggs glanced at Slater, then back at Bowen. "Mind if we take a look?" Bowen shifted uncomfortably but didn't argue. He stepped aside, letting the two officers enter. The house was dark and cluttered, the smell of stale cigarettes hanging in the air. Bowen led them through to the backyard, where the green sedan sat under a thin layer of dirt and fallen leaves. The engine hood was propped up, and sure enough, it looked like it hadn't run in a long time. Briggs frowned. "You sure you haven't driven this lately?" "I told you," Bowen said, his irritation growing. "The damn thing won't start." The situation was getting them nowhere. The car hadn't moved in months, and there was no sign that it had been anywhere near Emily Dawson in recent weeks. But something still didn't sit right with Briggs. Bowen was hiding something, but was it connected to Emily's murder? So there wasn't enough to hold him on, so after a tense exchange, the sheriff and Slater left. As they drove away, Slater looked over at Briggs. "You think he's involved?" Briggs stared out the window at the darkening sky. "I don't know. But I think he's lying about something, so we need to keep an eye on him." The investigation seemed to hit a wall after their encounter with David Bowen. Though he's still on their radar, the lead with the gray on had dried up. Meanwhile, Emily's funeral was scheduled for the weekend, and Cedar Creek was bracing for a day of grief. The town was still buzzing with anxiety, but amid the sorrow, people were demanding answers. The pressure on Sheriff Briggs grew, the weight of responsibility becoming almost unbearable. Then, just 2 days before the funeral, a new and unexpected lead fell into their lap. A call came into the sheriff's office from an anonymous tipster. The voice on the other end was shaky, nervous. I think I saw something. That night, the night Emily went missing," the caller stammered. "But I didn't come forward because I didn't want to get involved." Briggs' pulse quickened as he held the phone to his ear. "Go on. What did you see?" "I was driving down the old logging road, out past the diner," the caller continued. "It was late. I saw a car pulled over on the side of the road. Looked like someone was talking, maybe arguing. I didn't see who it was, but I saw the car. It was dark, but I remember the headlights. It was an old green sedan." Briggs felt a chill run down his spine. "And you're sure about the car?" "Yeah," the voice said, now trembling. "It was that car. I swear." Briggs quickly took down the details, trying to keep his voice calm. "Why didn't you report this earlier?" "I was scared. You don't know who to trust in this town anymore," the caller whispered. "But after hearing about Emily, I couldn't keep it to myself." As soon as the call ended, Briggs turned to Slater, his mind racing. Bowen lied. His car was there that night. Slater's eyes widened, so he was following her. "Looks like it," Briggs said, his face grim. "We're going to bring him in. No more playing around." With renewed determination, Briggs knew it was time to confront David Bowen head-on. They had the connection they needed, and now it was time to see how far this trail would lead. In Cedar Creek, where secrets festered in the shadows, the noose was tightening around the truth. But as they prepared to take Bowen into custody, Briggs couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over yet. The truth behind Emily's murder was more twisted than they had ever imagined, and uncovering it might cost more than they bargained for. Sheriff Briggs and Deputy Slater wasted no time. Armed with the new information about the green sedan spotted on the night of Emily's disappearance, they made their way back to David Bowen's house. This time, they weren't coming just to talk. As they approached, the tension was palpable. Bowen had lied, and now it was time to find out why. When they arrived at his property, Briggs signaled to Slater to cover the back door in case Bowen tried to make a run for it. Briggs knocked hard, the sound echoing off the walls of the old house. After a few tense seconds, the door swung open, revealing a visibly agitated Bowen. His eyes darted nervously between Briggs and the patrol car parked outside. He knew something had changed. "David Bowen," Briggs said sternly, "we have reason to believe you were involved in the disappearance and murder of Emily Dawson. We're bringing you in for questioning." For a moment, Bowen looked like he might bolt. His large frame tensed, and his eyes flickered toward the edge of the woods behind his house. But something in Briggs' voice made him stop. He gritted his teeth, clenching his fists, before slowly stepping out of the doorway. "You got it wrong, Sheriff," he muttered, but he didn't resist as they cuffed him and led him to the patrol car. Back at the station, they put Bowen in the interrogation room. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a harsh glow on his face. He sat across from Briggs and Slater, his demeanor shifting between defiance and unease. Briggs sat down, leaning forward, locking eyes with Bowen. "You lied to us," he began, his voice cold. "So we know your car was seen near the diner the night Emily disappeared. Why were you there?" Bowen's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Briggs leaned in further. "You think staying quiet is going to help you? We've got enough to hold you on, Bowen. But if you come clean, if you tell us what happened, things might go easier for you." Bowen finally spoke, his voice low and resentful. "I didn't kill her." "But you followed her," Slater cut in, watching Bowen carefully. "You were stalking her, weren't you? We have witnesses who saw your car, and we have proof you were lying about it being broken down. Why were you following her?" Bowen let out a long breath, his eyes darkening with frustration. "All right, yeah, I followed her, but not like you think. I wasn't stalking her." "Then what were you doing?" Briggs pressed, his patience wearing thin. Bowen ran a hand through his hair, his fingers shaking slightly. "I was trying to protect her." Both Briggs and Slater froze for a second, surprised by the unexpected response. "Protect her from what?" Briggs asked, his voice steady but his mind racing. Bowen hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to continue. Finally, he broke the silence. "There's this guy," he began slowly. "Emily came to me a while back. She said she thought someone was watching her, someone dangerous. She didn't want to go to the cops because she didn't have any proof. And she didn't want her parents to find out. I've known her since she was a kid, so I told her I'd keep an eye out for her. That's why I was following her that night. I thought maybe this guy was tailing her." Briggs leaned back, crossing his arms. "Who's this guy?" Bowen shook his head. "I don't know his name. Emily didn't give me many details, but she was scared of him. I think she knew more than she let on." The story seemed far-fetched, but something in Bowen's voice had shifted. He wasn't defensive anymore. He seemed genuinely rattled, almost desperate to convince them. "Why didn't you come forward earlier?" Slater asked, skeptical. Bowen let out a bitter laugh. "You think anyone in this town would believe a guy like me? I've got a record. You'd have pinned it on me in a heartbeat." Briggs exchanged a glance with Slater. They had been so focused on Bowen, they hadn't considered that there could be someone else in the picture. But if what Bowen said was true, it meant Emily had been hiding something even bigger than they thought. Before Briggs could press further, the door to the interrogation room opened, and Officer Jenkins stepped in, a grim expression on his face. "Sheriff, you need to see this." Briggs excused himself and stepped out into the hallway with Jenkins. "What is it?" he asked, his frustration mounting. Jenkins handed him a file. "We got the lab results back from the forensic sweep of Emily's phone. There was a video file hidden in a deleted folder." Briggs opened the file and his eyes widened as he scanned the report. The video had been recorded the night Emily disappeared, just hours before she was killed. It showed Emily, visibly distressed, filming herself with shaky hands in her bedroom. Her voice, barely more than a whisper, sent a chill through Briggs as he read the transcript. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this secret. He told me he would kill me if I said anything, but I can't stay quiet anymore. If something happens to me, you need to know who it was." The recording ended abruptly, before Emily could reveal the name, but it was clear she had been in more danger than anyone realized. Chapter 10. The Final Hunt. Briggs stared at the video evidence, his mind spinning. Emily had known her Niller, and she had been planning to reveal the truth the night she disappeared. Whoever had been threatening her had made good on their promise. Back in the interrogation room, Briggs confronted Bowen with the new information. Emily knew who was after her, Briggs said, his voice deadly calm. She was scared for her life, but she never told anyone the name. "You say you were protecting her. But if that's true, why didn't you stop this?" Bowen's face went pale. "I told you, I didn't know who he was. She wouldn't tell me. I thought I could figure it out myself. Briggs knew they were closer than ever to the truth, but Bowen wasn't the key to solving this. The video had been Emily's last attempt to warn the world, but she had been silenced before she could finish. Now it was up to Briggs to piece together the rest. As they continued to press Bowen, another call came in, a crucial one. A new witness had come forward, someone who had seen a strange man lurking around the diner in the days leading up to Emily's disappearance. The description matched someone they hadn't considered before, Richard Marlowe, a drifter who had been working odd jobs around town and had crossed paths with Emily more than once. Marlowe had a history of violence, a short temper, and a habit of disappearing whenever things got tough. He had gone under the radar during the initial investigation, but now it was clear he was the missing piece. Briggs and his team sprang into action. They tracked Marlowe to a rundown motel just outside of Cedar Creek. As they approached, the air was thick with the weight of what was about to unfold. They had their suspect, but they knew this confrontation wouldn't end quietly. The hunt for Emily's killer was nearing its end, but Briggs could feel that this final confrontation wouldn't be without bloodshed. As they prepared to move in, the shadows that had haunted Cedar Creek for weeks were finally closing in. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the rundown motel where Richard Marlowe was holed up. Sheriff Briggs and his team had the place surrounded, their vehicles hidden behind overgrown shrubs and abandoned cars. The building was silent, except for the distant hum of highway traffic. Every moment of tension, every unanswered question from the past weeks had led to this. Briggs tightened his grip on the radio, his heart pounding in his chest as he spoke into it. "Do we move in on my signal? No one makes a move until I say." Deputy Slater stood beside him, his jaw clenched, eyes focused. "You think he's armed?" "Most likely," Briggs muttered. "He knows we're closing in. A guy like Marlowe won't go down without a fight." The motel's neon sign flickered erratically, casting shadows on the cracked pavement as they moved in silently, their footsteps muffled by the wet ground. Marlowe's room was near the end of the row, its window covered with a torn, yellowed curtain. Inside, they could see the faint glow of a television flickering. He was inside, but they had no idea what waited for them beyond that door. Briggs gave the signal. Two officers moved toward the back exit to cover any escape routes, while he and Slater approached the front. With weapons drawn, Briggs knocked hard on the door. The sound echoed through the night. "Richard Marlowe," Briggs shouted, his voice steady. "This is Sheriff Briggs. We know you're in there. We need to talk." Well, there was no response at first, just the low murmur of the television. The seconds stretched out painfully, each one a reminder that time was running out to bring justice to Emily Dawson's family. Finally, the floor creaked inside, and a shadow moved behind the curtain. "Marlowe," Briggs called again. "Open the door. We're not leaving until you come out." A tense silence followed, broken only by the sound of footsteps inching closer to the door. Slowly, it creaked open, revealing Richard Marlowe's disheveled figure. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot, his hair matted to his forehead. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, haunted, cornered. "What do you want, Sheriff?" Marlowe growled, leaning against the doorframe, his eyes darting between the officers. "We know what you did," Briggs said, his voice low but firm. "Emily Dawson, she was afraid of you. We have witnesses placing you near her the night she disappeared. It's over, Marlowe. Come with us." "Sir." Marlowe's face twisted into a sneer, but underneath the bravado, there was fear. "I didn't do anything," he spat, his voice shaky. "That girl, she was asking for trouble, always sticking her nose where it didn't belong." Briggs stepped forward, his gun steady. "Enough lies. We know you've been watching her, following her. She was ready to come forward and name you. That's why you killed her." Marlowe's eyes darkened, and for a moment Briggs saw the flicker of panic in his expression. He was cornered, and he knew it. Without warning, Marlowe lunged back into the room, slamming the door. "Move," Briggs shouted, kicking the door open, the wood splintering as he and Slater charged in. Inside, the room was a mess, clothes strewn everywhere, empty beer bottles and a half-burned cigarette still smoldering in an ashtray. Marlowe scrambled toward the nightstand, his hand reaching for something. Briggs reacted instinctively, firing a warning shot into the wall above his head. "I don't even think about it," he shouted, the sound of the gunshot ringing through the room. Marlowe froze, his hand hovering inches away from a knife on the table. His chest heaved, sweat pouring down his face. He was trapped. "You're done," Slater said, training his weapon on Marlowe. "Put your hands where we can see them." Slowly, Marlowe raised his hands, his face pale. The fight had drained out of him. He knew there was no escape. Briggs moved in, cuffing Marlowe's wrists tightly behind his back. As he did, the gravity of the moment hit. This was the man who had taken Emily's life, the predator who had terrorized her in those final days. "You don't know what she was into," Marlowe muttered as they led him out of the room. His voice had a bitter edge, a last attempt at defiance. "She wasn't as innocent as you all think." Briggs ignored him. He had heard enough lies. Justice was all that mattered now.